Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Tina Ray and I'm really delighted to be here today at Psychology First ELSA conference. Okay, I'm virtual, but I'm very, very delighted that I've been able to actually offer this contribution to a very special day. I know that you're going to find this extremely productive today and hopefully have a wonderful time in terms of being able to network with each other. The title of my keynote speech is Resilience and Recovery, a time to reflect and recharge. And I'm hoping that this session will give you an opportunity to really think about in more depth your own well-being and the need to actually take stock at this current moment in time, given the complex situation that we find ourselves in, both post-COVID and during this ongoing pandemic, and also sadly the war in Ukraine. So I'm going to make reference to a number of issues that may have impacted upon all of us during the last couple of years. As you know, I have formerly been a teacher for nearly 20 years and a psychologist since 2020. Oh gosh, let me think about this, 20 years now, 21 years. And I'm also an author, and hopefully many of you will know me from those publications for Nurture UK, and also of course for Hilton House publications. I want to say at the outset today that it's really, really important to factor this into our thinking. I'm going to be talking about a lot of different tools from psychological approaches that you may be making use of now, that you may be having to adapt in terms of your practice, in terms of interactions with the young people that you nurture and care for. And I'm a great believer in providing you with practical, user-friendly and evidence-based resources. However, I need to point out at the outset, I am in no way proposing that anyone in this audience, apart from those who are trained to be therapeutic workers, should be taking on the role of a therapist. What I do is I take tools from these approaches so that they can be used safely by the non-specialist in the school or learning context. So hopefully that will become clear and apparent throughout this session today. What is this current context that we find ourselves in? I think it's really important to flag up the kinds of things that our children and young people, and us as the adults who nurture them, have actually missed during this last couple of years. And we know very much that our children and young people have certainly missed out on opportunities to play, to socialise with each other, and also those rites of passage, those transitions between key stages, those transitions on leaving school, going into school, being prepared for key stage 2 in particular, key stage 3 also, have been missed by many of our children and young people. And this also, I think, has impacted on children, young people now currently undertaking assessments and exams. For many of them, particularly our A-level students, they will not have sat in a formal exam context so far. So I think we need to factor this into our thinking. I think obviously there have been gaps for some children in terms of learning, and they've lost some of the skills that they may have had previously developed. And for some of our children, that opportunity to be creative, to engage in creative play, to take regular exercise and just experience flow and fun and relax have all gone awry a bit, and they've missed out on many of those key opportunities. And this is particularly pertinent for those with special educational needs and those who come from more impoverished backgrounds where they've not had the opportunity to access outside play space. I'm also very conscious that in the area in which I live and work currently in Kent, that there are children, young people who do not have access to the internet, for example. So there are many children who did not have a laptop at home, who could not access lessons online. So there is a significant level of disadvantage that's become increasingly more apparent. And I think the COVID pandemic in particular has widened that gap. And I think also for some of our children, that access to resources and the access to those key nurturing adults has been missing for many. And those are the people that provide safety and nurture. They are the ELSAs. They are those people in schools who are supporting our children in terms of ensuring that they can engage in emotional regulation on a daily basis. And this is really, really difficult for them, I think. There is also, of course, a significantly higher number of children at a much earlier age who will have lost relatives due to COVID. So there's a real need, I think, for us to become very conscious and aware of how we support children and young people who are bereaved, who are suffering losses. However, having said all of this and having recognised some of those difficulties, I think it is vital that we remember that this is on a continuum. Not everyone is going to be affected in the same way, and not all of our children will experience these heightened levels of stress and anxiety. So it's very important that we do not allude all the time to this catch-up narrative, this notion that these children are all going to be damaged by their experiences, because clearly they're not. Many will be resilient. Many will have also thrived in that home learning context in the lockdown periods. For example, some of the ASD children, young people that I've worked with and I'm aware of, really did thrive when they were away from this overstimulated environment in school, and when they didn't have to socially interact with others, which they find quite tricky on a daily basis. So I think it's very important to factor that into our thinking. This is a continuum, and we must not talk about all of these children as if they are the COVID lost generation. They need to catch up all the time, because actually all of them will need to catch up to some extent, but it will be for very different reasons and for very different areas. So it's vital that we remember that and don't just allude to this all the time. I don't think they need to be focused on as having deficits. I think we need to focus now on building and recognising strengths. Look at what they've come through, look at what they've achieved, look at what they learnt during lockdowns, look at what they have done in terms of coming back into school and beginning to develop their skills once more. I think these are resilient, flexible children, young people, and I must emphasise that we need to factor that into our thinking at all times. I do also think it's important to remember, however, a significant impact that this current situation, ongoing in my view, will have had on many of our teachers and those supporting children and young people in schools. When the NASUWT did their big survey in April of last year, they surveyed 4,700 teachers. They found that these people had actually self-harmed during the pandemic, and 1 in 4 had access to clinical support. And I think there is this ongoing risk of vicarious trauma. And we are seeing teachers, I think, under far more stress than they have ever been. Because of course we know people who are actually on the ground working in schools, that COVID has not suddenly disappeared. And I'm not sure about the statistics currently, but I am totally aware that people are still being sent home. People are still getting sick. There is still difficulties for head teachers in terms of covering lessons and making sure that the timetable works appropriately to ensure that all children are accessing what they need to. The workforce remains under extreme pressure, and I think it's therefore essential that we put staff well-being first. So this notion of recharge and recovery is something that I really think is important that we focus on right now. Let's focus on recovery and recharging as opposed to catch up. Institute of Fiscal Studies has reported an 8.7 decline in wellbeing, and we know from NHS monitoring that the increase in self-harm is really, really significant, as is the increase in eating disorders, particularly amongst children who are much younger than previously identified. So really, really important. It's a continuum. For some of these children and young people, there will be a lifelong footprint that's left by this pandemic. We know that. But again, I'm reinforcing the fact, not for all. What I think is important is that we focus on recovery, and the need for recovery right now is really, really crucial, particularly when we're thinking about the fact that we have what I call underfunded systems. It's really, really vital. We have got teachers and support staff such as yourselves in schools now who are being tasked with supporting children's well-being, and for some of them who've experienced significant trauma. And this is really, really important to remember. This is not a fully funded system. There is a problem with accessing specialist support. So what does that do? It puts the burden on those people, such as yourselves, in schools. And we are finding that support staff in particular are increasingly asked to work with really quite traumatized children and young people at the top end of the continuum, because the waiting list in some areas, I have now been informed by colleagues, is approximately 3 years. It's around 18 months around, but that is still horrendous if you are a child who has got significant needs and you're self-harming. What schools are doing is that they are supporting mental health and well-being in many, many ways. And this is from Ofsted. And I think this is important, that schools are finding that what they're having to do now is employ and ensure that people are trained up to work with those children at the top end of the continuum, due to the fact that access to those services is significantly impaired at the moment. And also, from my perspective here, I'm well aware that the threshold for actually accessing CAMHS support individually for children and young people has been raised significantly. And of course, we now sadly have this ongoing war in the Ukraine. So we are also dealing with the influx of children and young people who have genuinely experienced huge amounts of stress, trauma, and anxiety. And I think this is compounding for some of our staff in schools, the anxiety levels that they have already been building up during the last 2 years. However, and I do think it's important to flag this up, it's vital that we do not panic about this at the outset. And it's easy to get into that frame of mind where we feel totally overwhelmed. But I think from all the research that I have done, and it's a great deal now, I'm just about to publish a new book on this particular topic, packed full of practical ideas and resources, which again are evidence-based. And I think this is vital. We know from the research that many refugee children and young people are resilient. They cope well with adversity and they do well in school. The majority of young refugees will cope well with the terrible events that they may have been exposed to and the very difficult experiences and circumstances which they and their families have to live currently and previously, prior to coming to this country of sanctuary, hopefully, for many of them. So I think it's vital that we don't panic. The research shows us the evidence is there. And there are 6 main areas of support that I think it was the NUT actually that identified these in 2004. Our refugee families and their children will be able to ask for help and support, and that's vital at the outset. The most significant impairment factor is the language barrier. Think about this, is absolutely logical. So asking for help with learning the language is absolutely vital, and us as the adults and carers need to be providing that for our children and young people and those families. But they're going to need support to understand school systems here, to understand the way education works, what's expected. They're going to need a proper induction in terms of getting into school, getting the support there. We can utilise the skills of other children. That's very, very clear and self-evident. We have lots of young people who are more than able to take on that role of the buddy for these children and young people, to translate for them, to help them, to Google Translate on using their laptops, to actually take them around the school, introduce them, play with them, be that person, maybe setting up circle of friends if appropriate. And also creating this climate in which our refugee children and young people feel welcome and valued. And that's essential. This nurturing school of sanctuary is something that I think all of us need to really focus on as we welcome these children in. And of course, the curriculum needs to be made accessible, and that's a given, alongside classroom organisation, the seating plans, who they're supported by and with, how you access that E2L, the English as a Second Language support, how you factor that into what you're doing in school, and also the setting up and provision for those families of family liaison officers who can work in the community and bring those children and their families in a safe way, providing them with the kind of support and induction and ongoing support, therapeutically perhaps in some instances, that they might need. So if you look at this, these 6 main areas of support, again, this is not rocket science. This is, for me, is actually basic common sense psychology that all of us can make use of in school. And also, when I say don't panic, I think it's really important that we think about what we are already doing in schools. I'm a positive psychologist. I'm a great believer in actually identifying our strengths, and what works and what is working well, and building on those for our children and young people. You will already, I know, be well informed around trauma-informed classrooms, how to set those up. There will be a great deal of mental health awareness. We have our mental health leads in schools now. There's been a plethora of support and training offered in this area currently. Sometimes I don't think it's probably as comprehensive as it possibly could be, but it's out there. Also, from your educational psychologists, you can gain that kind of level of support around grief, loss and bereavement, and an understanding of how to respond and how not to respond, what support is actually needed. Many of our schools will have had support previously for critical incidents. You will have a critical incident team via your educational psychology service in your local authority in many instances. There will also be emotionally available adults who can help children regulate. They can co-regulate with them, provide that sense of belonging. Hopefully, I think in many instances, there will also be a much greater understanding of anxiety, how that manifests itself and how that very often appears as so-called disruptive behaviour. Anger, frustration, fear, anxiety is not simple. And I think it's very important that we understand that in schools. And I really do think that there is an increased understanding in many of the institutions in which I have been working. Also creating these safe spaces of sanctuary, calm corners, safe spaces where children can retreat and engage in co-regulation with a supportive, nurturing adult, such as the ELSA in the school. I think there's a notion as well of this compassionate relationships and how they build strengths in children and young people, and they promote mental health well-being overall. We know that good behaviour, good mental health emanates from properly good, compassionate relationships. Also, I think there's much more of an understanding of how we can share our tools and strategies and resources across our schools. And many of the schools that I've worked with are coming together to share clinical support. They're employing a clinical support person, such as a creative arts therapist, for example, who can work across 2 or 3 or more of their schools. So sharing that knowledge, sharing our strategies so that we build these resilient and safe communities in which children can become self-sufficient and they can become resilient. So I think it's really important. Let's remember the stuff that we're doing that really does work already. We can provide the safe base that children and young people need. And for many of these children coming in now, it is practical help and advice that they need first. The therapeutic stuff may be needed later for some, but in the first instance, it's practical help and support as opposed to a therapeutic care plan. So remember that school is the best medicine. We know this. Think about the number of instances when you've been watching the news and you've watched refugee children. For example, I was watching some the other day who'd come into Poland and they were in a safety area, and I think there were lots and lots of families around. The mothers clearly looked very, very distressed. What were the children doing? They were playing. They were safe to play, and they were laughing and they were giggling and they were sharing, they were taking turns. Remember this, very, very important. Children need socialization, access to resources, opportunities to play, and school provides them the structure and the nurture that they need. And they need this first. We can nurture resilience. We know that there are a number of specific interventions and supports. These have been identified as promoting resilience in refugee children. However, I would also flag up that they have also been shown to promote resilience in children and young people who are vulnerable, who have anxiety, who have difficulties at home, who have experienced traumatic circumstances and situations. So feeling loved, we know this, that caring, consistent adult. Feeling empowered, so teaching that host language, teaching children the skills that they need so that they can access and build their social network. Feeling engaged, so being really, really clear about understanding children's specific special educational needs, for example. And that is down to screening, because very often we won't have the appropriate paperwork. Feeling connected, so using those group processes in class to facilitate those friendships, setting up circle of friends, buddy systems. Again, it's not rocket science. And to cope. This is essential to cope. So really ensuring that there are programs that they can access which build their self-esteem, social skills, their internal locus of control. And some of these will be therapeutic in design. Some of them will extrapolate those therapeutic processes. So there will be opportunities to learn key tools and strategies from CBT, for example, from mindfulness, from positive psychology. Very, very important. And I think this is all pertinent now for all of our children, and the skill set of the ELSA in particular really does highlight that. Your role, what I think we're doing is taking on this role of the emotionally available adult. And I think now it's more crucial than ever in schools that all of us can do this and really do take on this role, truly listening, using that proper, really skillful listening and understanding how we can teach and support children to be regulated. We can co-regulate with them because we ourselves are regulated, and creating the safe spaces in which they can do that. Now, for our refugee children, and I think for children with trauma, there is a very useful set of tools in terms of making use of expressive writing approaches. And I would thoroughly recommend to you that if you are concerned about this and you want more information and more support, please go to the Children and War Foundation website, because they have so much there that is incredibly useful and has been translated into a number of languages, including Russian and Ukrainian. It's vital. Children can be encouraged to write about their experiences in their first language, however they can access this. It can be written, it can be illustrated, but this is really, really vital. James Pennebaker, for example, really highlighted the fact that writing feelings about an emotional experience can help to reduce distressing reactions and improve health physically and health mentally. And it's about that process of creating and opening up to a really helpful narrative that helps us to process those fears, those anxieties, those worries, those traumas. Also, of course, physical approaches. This very often works as a temporary distraction, but it helps a child or young person to produce those endorphins, those chemicals necessary in the brain that help us resolve those difficult situations. So it's vital that we really timetable in for our children and young people opportunities to play, to exercise, to be out in nature. And also, of course, calming approaches. And the ELSA, I think very often this is bread and butter for many of us. Really, really important that we teach these. These calming approaches can really support the child to overcome that body's fight, flight and freeze response, i.e. activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And this can quell and does quell anxiety and anger. Now, I think what's important to highlight here is that these things have to be taught, but they also have to be practiced. And this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's very, very important to factor into our thinking. Yoga, meditation, massage, mindfulness activities, breathing exercises in particular can be very useful, but what works for me may not work for you. What works for one child may not work so well for another. For example, many ASD children that I've worked with do not engage well in mindfulness in a group context. They find it incredibly stressful because they are hypervigilant and they do not want to shut their eyes. They don't feel safe. And many traumatized children don't feel safe to do that also. So I think it's very important to factor that into our thinking too, that it has to be bespoke to the individual child, young person. I like to teach a range of different tools, and then we experiment. We find out what works best for each individual, and we put that into our well-being plan, into our toolbox of well-being, and then we review it on a regular basis. So we keep that well-being journal, that log of how we are looking after our heads. Creating a calm corner and safe space. Again, I think that now, in my view, this is something that is needed in every single educational context. And of course, it needs to be age appropriate. It needs to be factoring in the need maybe for adult support at times or peer support. You also need to ensure that you're teaching children what this is for and how to use it. And I think it's really, really important, because this space can provide the opportunity for children and young people to learn more about how they can manage their fears, their anxieties, their worries. It can teach them a range of skills. It can provide opportunities for co-regulations with adults. And it can also provide a refuge for children and young people who simply need to be perhaps with their grief and to have some time quietly to process that in a private way. So really, really vital that we think about this. Also, I think a plus here, of course, is that there are many anxiety easy wins, I call them, that we can be making use of and should be making use of in our schools right now, if we're going to ensure that children, young people and adults recover and recharge. Structure and routine. When we're in distress, when we're in a panic, we always, or a disaster happens, we always respond better to structure and routine. It reduces anxiety. We know this particularly for our ASD children and young people, but I think this goes without saying now that it really is something we need to factor in to the way in which we're working with all our children currently. Making sure they do have that exercise, play, free time daily, quality time, where they're relaxing. Limiting access to news, which is ongoing, which traumatizes or re-traumatizes children. I think we need to be very clear about that, having a digital detox daily and being very clear that we actually talk responsibly to children, young people about what is going on out there, both in terms of COVID and the ongoing war. I also think reflecting on the positives can be so useful. It's a simple, easy thing to do at the end of the day, to do my positive journal, my gratitude journal, 3 good things, thinking about 3 kind acts that I've done or that I'm going to do tomorrow, so that the last thing I do at night as a young person or child is not be worrying. I take off my worry hat and I focus on the positives. And that's what I'm going to bed thinking about as I'm trying to sleep. And maintaining and building relationships. These are the things that heal. So more than ever, making time for those relationships, even if that means making less time for other things that people think we should be doing, such as the reading, the writing, the spelling, etc., I think is vital right now. I cannot focus, I cannot engage my cognitive abilities if I am traumatized, if I'm overwhelmed and anxious. So the relationships have to come first. Wonderful Chris Moore, who's an educational and child psychologist from Belfast, I follow on Twitter, does wonderful blogs on this particular topic around nurture, well-being, mental health for children and young people. And he talks about the 6 keys to creating and building this trauma-informed classroom. And it's around belonging, making sure someone feels that they belong, that things are predictable, things are very organized, children have regular opportunities to self-regulate, things are appropriately differentiated, and relationships come first. And that really reinforces all that I've said just now in terms of the key messages. So we can create safety, we can support children to regulate their nervous system. We know how to do this. I think this is bread and butter for the ELSA. We can also build those connected relationships and support what we call the development of a coherent narrative. And I think that that is absolutely crucial, a coherent narrative. One of the reasons why I'm so anxious sometimes is because I haven't processed my fears, what's happened to me, and I need to talk about it. And in that talking, it becomes coherent. It doesn't become an unstoried set of fears. It becomes something that I've given voice to. And that is what I think key skills from someone like the ELSA can really support the child in doing. And also power with. If you are someone who's been traumatized, very often you've had your power taken away. So we need to ensure that children feel that they have autonomy, that they have some level of choice. And building social emotion resiliency skills through all those different interventions that I've mentioned will ensure that a child or young person can engage in post-traumatic growth. There is hope here, and it's vital that we maintain that hope. What is essential, however, is that we listen to the voice of the child. That is absolutely crucial in my view. And how often do we really do this? When I was an educational child psychologist, first starting out in 2000 it was, I always remember writing reports and having this tiny paragraph about what the child said, and sometimes not even including it because it was deemed that we couldn't actually get the views of the child because they were non-verbal. Absolutely outrageous practice. I would never do this now. What is it that they want? This should come first, because very often they're also told us what they do not want. John McMullen and Anne O'Hare, two very, very brilliant educational child psychologists, conducted research in Ireland with Syrian refugees. And I really took on board some of their key messages from the blog that they produced in March this year. And they were talking about being very clear about not treating all refugees as a homogeneous group. They need to be treated as individuals, just as children, young people in all our schools do currently. Vital, as I said, it's their own wellbeing toolbox. But listen to the message. One child saying, I had to do a poster about refugees, and in my last year, the teacher asked me to go to their classroom, talk more about Syria and the refugees and things. I found it kind of hard to talk at the back, old, harmful memories. And like, I actually didn't really want to talk about it. That is so not okay. What did I say? School is the best medicine. Children, most refugees will tell you, I just want to be treated like everyone else. Don't make me an exception. If I need help with my mental health, I'll probably show you and I'll ask for it. But so, so important. I also think one significant thing that they did point out, I think is important. There is a lot of kind of very dual stuff going on in terms of talking about the conflict currently. One's good, one's a bad side. All Russian children speaking in our schools, will they feel vulnerable now because they are being perceived to be part of the attack on these innocent children and young people in Ukraine? We've got to be very, very clear. We've got lots of children who speak Russian. We've got people from Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Moldova, Georgia, etc. So be very clear that we are really specific in terms of being clear and understanding and clarifying that these kinds of dichotomies are not appropriate. It can be quite damaging and lead to bullying. When I worked as a teacher in the Inner London Education Authority, and I started, I think it was 1983, we obviously had lots of refugee children in Inner London. And I, as a young teacher, obviously did not come from an area where we had such a diverse population. So this was all new to me when I moved to London. And I found it quite unnerving initially. And I was very, very worried about doing damage, doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing. And I went to talk to my very wise head teacher, Frank Hamner, who's sadly passed away now. And I said, I don't know how to approach this. I don't know whether I should talk about things, whether I should discuss it. And he said, no, just treat him like anyone else. We're getting him the English language support he needs. He said, just ask him, he said, because he did speak some English. He said, just ask him, he said, about his favourite football team. Don't ask him about his journey to the UK. And actually, you know, I did. I asked him and his face lit up. And I think this was such an important moment for me in terms of my practice, thinking about how I would interact with a child who'd experienced that level of trauma. Sadly for me, the team he supported was Chelsea, but never mind. So ultimately, I think currently it's about being the helper. Every time we see a war zone, there will be people out there helping, Red Cross, people teaching children, young people, even with the bombs coming down, people, psychologists such as myself, giving children, young people therapeutic support at this current time. People will be helping, gathering information for people coming into this country, providing resources, setting up food packages, clothes packages, etc. This is really, really important. Positive, looking for the helpers and trying to be one ourselves. Children and young people need to be encouraged in this way too, to be the helper. And remembering school is the best medicine for our traumatized children and young people. So, not rocket science, remember this. Look at what we're doing now. Look at how we provide that sense of safety. We're doing so much already. Knowing that being in school can be the best medicine, knowing that we can and are providing trauma-informed classrooms and approaches. We are the emotionally available adults that can support our children and young people to regulate. And we can create the team around the child in which we really are remaining vigilant, observing, reflecting, having those mini little network meetings so that we can say, I am actually concerned about this child at the moment. It's about watchful waiting currently. And if we are unsure, many of our CAM services who cannot provide direct support We'll be able to provide support via the phone in terms of a consultation around specific children or issues. So don't forget that. Also factoring into our thinking now, grief and loss will be all around. So it's vital that we really understand the process of grief. We reject this linear notion, the Kubler-Ross stages, because actually we know that's not how it works. It's much more around this kind of messy Tiomkin model where we grow around grief. But remember the pain of that. It's the most intensely painful experiences any human being can suffer. And our children, young people will now, some of them, be suffering, experiencing this at a much earlier stage than would previously be expected. And our refugee children will experience grief and loss, losing the loss of their way of life, their home, their school, their friends, their family. So that's significant to remember too. So we need to understand grief, the fact that it's loss, and then it's remaking of life, and how to support children in that process. So please access additional support if you are unaware or you feel slightly disempowered in that particular area, because we're going to need this at this notion at this current time. We're also going to need to remember that these positive, warm relationships really do help to build healthy brains. So let's be that individual person who can effectively support the child or young person so that they can make that healthy separation and move on and engage in post-traumatic growth. We're the key adults here. And my key message today, I think, is that you, as the person who is being the support network for a child or young person, has to be that person who is nurturing their own empathic brain at all times. And in order to do this, we have to engage in what I call really appropriate self-care. And for many, this seems to be quite a hackneyed concept, and many people will poo-hoo it, talking, as if it's some kind of cheesy option. Well, of course, I don't think so remotely. I think for me, mental health has to be the essential focus. If we are seeking to maintain healthy, productive, regulated workforces in school, we know that that is inextricably linked to looking after ourselves and the team first. So this is a dual responsibility of senior leaders in school, but also of us as individuals. We need to take personal responsibility, initially focusing now on what we can control, the way in which we look after ourselves, our own behaviours, how we're eating, how we're exercising, etc., and what we can't control. So focusing on what we can control needs to come first. And also ensuring that we have what I call a healthy mind platter. And this comes from the work of David Rock and Daniel Siegel. We all need to have this balance between sleep, physical activity, focusing in time, but time in just for ourselves, downtime where we stop thinking about all our worries. We might just be watching a few episodes of Coronation Street, whatever it is that you like to relax to or with. But there is also time to play and time to connect with other people, and making sure that when we are connecting, we're connecting with people who are themselves nurturers, who build us up, who promote our well-being, and it's reciprocal. Okay, so very important, more than ever, in my view, that we actually reduce our access or interactions with what I call psychic vampires. That can be very difficult if they're in your family, but I think it is really, really important. Those people that drain you, that seem to feed from you, as opposed to have a reciprocal relationship that is mutually beneficial. So really, really vital to have that healthy daily platter. I talk about nurturing your empathic brain in terms of ensuring that you promote and manage your physical needs for self-care, your intellectual needs, so that you are accessing and promoting really good, effective thinking in your own head. Okay, recognizing that the thoughts that we have are very often inaccurate and need to be challenged. What are your practical, financial, emotional, and the access to people who can understand you emotionally? What are those needs and how are they being met? And also your own emotional needs. How are you keeping and being in touch with your own feelings and being able to talk about them and express them, as I said earlier, making a sensible, coherent narrative? So I think when you stop and reflect on this, it's really, really important to think about those 4 key areas And one activity I think would be really helpful for you to take away today from this session, and go away and actually please do this, is to just take a piece of paper, divide it into 4 and put physical, intellectual, emotional support needs, and jot down all the different things you're doing. Discuss this with a friend or a colleague, because maybe there are things that you need to do a bit more of. Maybe there are things you need a bit less of, but are they all healthy? Are they all promoting your well-being so that you can truly nurture your empathic brain and enable yourself to be fit for purpose in terms of continuing to do the job that you do in nurturing children and young people, many of whom will need a huge amount of nurturing at this current time. So what is your role in providing this peer support, and who supports you? Again, questions to reflect on subsequent to this session. Who supports the nurturers? I think this is really vital, this role of the emotionally available adults. Very, very significant in children and young people's lives, those who have experienced anxiety. But understanding this anxiety and how it manifests itself is obviously an absolute key essential. What children experience when they have anxiety, what they have experienced, is usually something that's been very, very frightening. It's made them feel profoundly unsafe in the world. And for some, it will be their experience of being a refugee. For others, it will be multiple school placements, being looked after, being physically, sexually, emotionally abused, having parents who are drug addicts, for example. I think very, very important. What the research shows us is the best way to alleviate anxiety, rather than just trying to manage it, is to address the feelings that were experienced at that painful life event. For many of our children and young people, they can't do this on their own. That's why they bottle it up, and it remains trauma in their bodies, and it manifests itself for many, many years. Having an emotionally available adult, someone who can really listen and empathize and help them make sense of that, is key to this, okay? And why is this the case? It's because those feelings about that situation, that event that happened, can be so, so dangerous that they can't actually feel this on their own. They need to be with someone else, that secure base with the adult who can understand and help them to process this. And very, very important, they will be frightened. They'll experience levels of shame. They'll think they're going mad, and really, really are frightened of this strength of the rage that they might experience. And that's why anxiety does develop in the first instance. Freud said anxiety protects them from fear. So learning how to engage with supportive, curious inquiry from an adult trained to listen is vital. Now, if you feel as the ELSA you need more support to become the person who can engage in supportive, curious inquiry, then talk to your EP, talk to a clinical psychologist, maybe from the local service, who may be able to provide additional training and support. Again, I would make reference to trauma-informed school systems and processes, and maybe actually accessing some specific training in this. Remember this, anxiety is fueled by what Heather Geddes called wordless emotions, unstoried emotions. And Heather Geddes said also that these unbearable feelings can transform into thinkable thoughts. So that means that this traumatic memory can evolve from a haunting nightmare into an integrated part of our life story. And that's what I was talking about when I talked about making a coherent narrative. This is key to our role. The only way that we can do this is by knowing that we're doing the right thing and accessing appropriate training. But also, we can only do this if we are the regulated adults who are consistently nurturing our own empathic brains. The reality in schools is that many of us will be taking on this role and feeling slightly unnerved by it at this current time. There is a need for supervision and training, and I know that you access this as the ELSAs currently, and that's fantastic, and that's the way it really should be, and it should always have been. It wasn't previously. In many instances in school, those providing this kind of support were not receiving appropriately clinical supervision, in my view. So thinking about what you need to do for yourself now without a great deal of external support may also be necessary. I think maybe think about peer group supervision systems that you have and maybe increasing those. It may be necessary for school teams to actually access and make use of peer supervision systems. I'm promoting this from Nurture UK, and I think they're very, very important. We produced the Wellbeing Toolkit for Mental Health Leads for Hinton, but also for Nurture UK, I produced a Wellbeing Toolkit too. And that, in essence, provides a huge wealth of resources to ensure that those taking on this role can actually feel grounded in a range of therapeutic approaches. And that's essential when we think about the emotional labour of the work. So really what I'm flagging up here is think about the supervision needs. Are they greater? Do people in schools currently not accessing supervision in this way need to access it? I would really recommend that they do. Reflection is key here, because we need to be thinking about why we do what we do, what works, what doesn't work, what makes it better. So this is why I think supervision is essential for those working in schools and undertaking this particular role. I want to flag up, of course, I don't make money from this resource at all. This is something that we did pro bono for Nurture UK because we want to support nurturers, those working in Nurture. And I'm sure that much of this will be totally relevant to you too. Reflection is important because it results in learning. We need to think about what we're doing, why we're doing it. We need to be active, recognizing the cyclical nature. Okay, and it's really important as well because it actually helps us recognize teaching, supporting children and young people in schools emotionally is really tricky. It's complex, it's messy. There are problems, there are difficulties, there are issues. And being able to reflect on those, to problem solve together, to learn from each other is absolutely essential because we can then plan our next stages of learning and development. And we can look at things from different perspectives. There is a power, a strength in the group. It helps us to challenge views and ideas that we might have made, the assumptions we may have made that may be inaccurate, and recognize that our perspective needs to come alongside someone else's and can be complemented by someone else's. So there's a real power in this. So vital, because no one knows as much as all of us, an essential thing to remember. So reflecting and recharging. My key message today, this is an essential task for all of us at this current time. What is it that you can do right now? And I think that there is an issue in schools, and I am banging on about this all the time, that senior leaders in schools need to make sure that they put the staff teams first now, to make sure that their mental health is protected and further enhanced if they're going to be fit for purpose. But I also think as individuals, whoever we are working in school, whether we're the ELSA, the mental health lead, any teacher in any curriculum area, we need to take responsibility for our own well-being. And that's not always easy. And sometimes we are more able to do this than at other times, but it's an essential. I very often develop what I call these plans, and I put them out there on Twitter, which is probably the only social network that I regularly use in terms of being able to share resources with colleagues. So this Find Your Calm plan I put out last year during the lockdowns. And I really wanted to try and enhance parents and those working in school, the ability to actually find their calm so that they could help support their children and young people who were experiencing heightened levels of stress and anxiety. And so please follow me on Twitter, because very often you can just download this stuff and then you can make use of it in your own context and take it away and have some time to reflect on it. So I'm going to, for the last part of this session, focus on this particular plan. So each initial letter, the F, Find Your Calm plan, focus on what you can control to reduce your anxiety. And I said this earlier, reinforcing it now, an absolute key essential as we go forward. Identifying 3 positives at the end of each day and revisiting them at the start of the next day. It sounds cheesy, but positive psychologists and those who research in this area have shown us that this does have a significantly positive impact on well-being. Not rocket science, common sense. Neutralize negative thoughts by reframing them into more effective ones. Remember, this is not as simple as changing a a negative to a positive. This is about making something that's ineffective and not helpful to us, and you'll know this from your own training in CBT, into something that's more helpful. And remembering always, a thought is not necessarily true. What we're thinking might be totally wrong, and very often we need to be challenging ourselves more. Developing a self-care plan, sticking to it, an absolute key essential. I write it down. If I don't write it down and I don't actually make a plan for the week as to what I'm going to do each day, particularly in terms of my physical health, and timetabling in the gym sessions, the rowing, when I'm going to go for walks, then it won't happen. Very, very important. Remembering we need to factor this into our thinking all the time. This is not selfish. We can't pour from empty vessels. Putting ourselves first, okay, making sure that we're relaxing is vital. We can then share that calm with the child. We can't regulate others if we are unregulated ourselves, and we know this is an absolute given in my view. Observing our breathing and doing breaths when it becomes shallow or tight, too high up. We're not breathing from the diaphragm. I've just published a session on my YouTube channel on breathing techniques, so do make reference to that if you wanted to follow up on this. So very, very important, taking that time to pause and breathe deeply. Understanding it's normal to feel anxious when we're in uncertain times. We've got to try always to remain hopeful. There is always hope, even in the darkest times. These things will pass. We need to factor that into our thinking daily. Regulate regularly, so using grounding, best breathing, mindfulness, exercise, whatever it is that helps you soothe your nervous system, trying it out, what works best for me, knowing practice really does make better. Not perfect, but better. Co-regulating with your child or young person. I'm going to get better at this on a daily basis. Mirror me, let's do this together. Let's hold our hands. Let's do the deep breathing together. Okay, let's jog it out. Let's work together. Let's draw out the worries, etc. So knowing that we can do that. Also, let's show ourselves a bit more self-compassion. There's no such thing as a perfect teacher, ELSA human being. All we can be is the best that we can be. And that's good enough. Okay, we need to remember that. We don't always get it right. We need some time sometimes just to really take time to vent. And there is no perfection in this world. It just doesn't happen. So let's show ourselves a bit more self-compassion and also being more solution focused. Okay, we've made a mistake. We don't need to be overwhelmed by it. Let's focus on what did work a bit better and let's problem solve instead of being problem focused. And we will need to moderate those self-care plans. Finding our calm daily is going to benefit us and ours. So sometimes we will need to be a bit more flexible. We need to do a bit more of that, a bit less of the other. The 3 C's at the moment we have are challenges, keeping ourselves well, keeping others well that we work with in our school communities, and maintaining those supportive relationships that really do nurture our well-being. Those connections are crucial and vital. So make sure you keep them good and positive. Keeping everyone well at a whole school level through ensuring that there is a sense of relational safety, it's calm, we make sure that people can develop self-efficacy, the connection is there and the hope is there. Those are the key messages that we need to be really embodying at a whole school level. What we can control, retelling our stories of our strengths, building community connection, and simply engaging in what I call collective self-care space for 20 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. So at the start or the end of a team meeting, or just during the day with our mini team of ELSAs or our nurture group, whatever it is, that however we're working, where we just focus on sharing skills, strengths and ideas, only positives. This can be really beneficial. So going with grit, I suppose, is what I'm really ultimately talking about here. Staff well-being has to come first if we're going to be fit for purpose. Those well-being systems need to be coherent and explicit. And for some, there will be the need for those bespoke therapeutic interventions, but they're going to be the minority. Go back as far as Warnock, the 2%. There may be some need for additional training, maybe as the ELSA, maybe you will want to undertake some additional CBT training in a more specialist context at some point. Maybe this is what school staff at senior level need to be factoring into their thinking, training individuals in schools to take on more of a therapeutic role. Flexible, blended options which ensure access and inclusion for all. Some of our children thrived out of school. Never forget this. And we need to perhaps be more nuanced in thinking about more flexible options for those, particularly with special educational needs, who have thrived outside of the school context. And that takes creativity. It also takes a bit of bravery and grit. We need to shift this narrative in terms of actually thinking about recovery so that we maintain hope now, building our strengths, because we've got lots of them. So from my perspective, I'm hoping that today this key message that I'm leaving you with is that it is a time now to build our resilience, to recharge, so that we can all recover and continue to recover and engage in what I call post-traumatic growth. This is something that all of us need to engage in at this current time. Of course we do. So thank you very, very much for listening. I hope very much that this has been a useful session. You will have access to this recording. You will also have access to my PowerPoint slides. So please, please make use of them, adapt them for your own purposes if you want to. And thank you again for listening. And I hope you have a fantastic day today and you go away feeling fully recharged. Goodbye.